Theodore Flowers was born on August 5, 1895, to sharecropping parents in Camilla, Georgia. As a young man, he held numerous odd jobs until moving to Philadelphia, where he worked as a laborer on a shipyard. At the age of 15, he fought in bootleg bouts and battle royals, coming under the tutelage of fighter Rufus Cameron. Now nicknamed the Tiger, Flowers had his first official fight against an up-and-comer named Billy Hooper, stopping him over 11 rounds. Hooper's face had been beaten up so bad that he was unrecognizable. Flowers was then contacted by Hooper's manager, Walk Miller, who persuaded him to join his stable of fighters. Starting Flowers out at $15 a week as the gym's janitor, Miller took the Tiger on a tour of Kentucky and Ohio, where he knocked out local pool hall bullies and gained a reputation as a fearsome fighter. Miller had a black satin robe with an open-mouthed tiger on the back, custom-made for Flowers. He put up posters with Flowers' head on the body of a tiger with the words of Psalm 144 written beneath it, a Bible passage that Flowers whispered to himself before every fight. "Blessed be the Lord my strength, which teacheth my hands and fingers to fight." Deeply religious, Flowers carried his Bible everywhere he went, as if it were a good luck charm. But he never prayed before a fight. "I couldn't pray to the Lord to allow me to win a fight," Flowers said, "because the good Lord may have made my opponent a better man than me. If I should lose the fight, I'd have trouble with myself to keep from thinking that the Lord had turned me down. I always wait until after the fight, and then thank the Lord for seeing me safely through." His humble personality and clean style of fighting made him a fan favorite despite the color barrier. Miller himself matched Flowers in personality. Soft-spoken and quiet, he was a stark contrast to the loudmouth managers and promoters of the time period. Miller started as a streetcar conductor in Atlanta. He was an athlete as well, competing in bicycle races until entering the fight game as a side hustle. The tagline for his boxing stable was "Fighters Who Fight," and Flowers lived up to the slogan more so than anyone. Flowers was described as a clever and speedy southpaw, sometimes switching to the orthodox stance. One reporter described him as, quote, "not spectacular in his footwork, but resembling a panther in his movements. He glides into striking range, but leaps back with the ability of a cat." During the early years of his career, Flowers was limited to facing only other black fighters. He let the promoters name the enemy, and was sometimes outweighed by more than 60 pounds. Flowers won significantly more than he lost, but he suffered defeats to Panama Joe Gans, Kid Norfolk, the Jamaica Kid, and the great Sam Langford. In May of 1922, the size difference proved to be too much when he challenged Lee Anderson for Anderson's colored light heavyweight title. Anderson overpowered Flowers and knocked him out in 7 rounds. "I was beaten by a better man," Flowers said. "Anderson is too big for me. He hits too hard. All I ask of the management is that they match me against a middleweight. Match me up with a boxer of my own size, and I will fight faster than ever before." Flowers turned the corner by 1923, posting revenge victories over the Jamaica Kid, Panama Joe Gans, and Lee Anderson as he went on a prolonged winning streak. Reporters praised Flowers for his ability, starting their articles with the words, "Tiger Flowers and his fistic showers." During a trip to Ciudad Juarez in Mexico, Flowers won a series of fights before the local promoter drove him out to the country for a talk. He showed Flowers a farm and placed over $5,000 worth of gold in his hand. The promoter asked him to leave his current manager, Walk Miller, for him. "Stay down here with me," the promoter said, pointing to the lush Mexican farmland. "And all this is yours." Flowers shook his head. "Mister, I just can't," he replied. "I was a porter when Miller picked me up. I was getting $15 a week, and now he's making me rich." Flowers had earned over $500,000 in his career, and in 1924, he went on a 21-fight win streak before facing the legendary Harry Greb on August 21st of that year. Reporter James Schlemmer sat in with Flowers in his open-air dressing room just before the bout. "The only light came from the dimly lit moon," Schlemmer wrote, "and the Tiger had a Bible in his hands, but there was not enough light in the room for him to read it. He seemed to gain comfort out of holding the book. I asked him if he thought he could whip Greb. 'If the Lord is willing,' Flowers replied." Greb won a newspaper decision over 10 rounds, although the scoring was controversial. Most papers had the headline of Greb winning easily, but others stated that Greb didn't look so good and the bout should have been at least a draw. But Tiger's reputation grew after the fight. In his subsequent ring appearances, he smashed gate receipt records in 18 different towns. His gentlemanly and generous behavior ingratiated him to fans. On the way back after a fight in Mexico City, his train stopped into a town stricken by poverty. Flowers saw a group of hungry women and children. Wanting to help, he went into a bakery and spent over $25 to feed them all. Flowers began another win streak before suffering a shocking knockout loss to Jack Delaney in 2 rounds. Manager Walk Miller claimed that Delaney had a loaded glove and demanded a rematch. 1 month later, he got it, but Delaney proved that the first bout was no fluke, knocking out Flowers in 4 rounds with his big right. Flowers returned to the ring less than a month later, beating notables like Lou Bogash and Jock Malone before dropping an unfair decision to Mike McTeague. 2 months later, he once again faced Harry Greb on February 26, 1926, this time for the middleweight title. Flowers started fast and took the early lead. Greb worked back into the fight in the middle rounds, but by the 12th, the defending champion was spent. Flowers took command of the fight, winning the decision and taking the title. The decision was controversial, and some sports writers felt Greb won, but Davis Walsh of the Dayton Herald thought otherwise. Greb couldn't lick the flap of an envelope last night, Walsh wrote. Greb's performance was either that of a passé performer or a good fighter gone wrong. Flowers became the first black American in history to win the middleweight title, enjoying a hero's welcome parade and a banquet in his honor. On August 19, 1926, he rematched Greb in Madison Square Garden. Once again, the fight was close and the decision was controversial. The referee favored Greb, but the newspapermen had Flowers winning 8 rounds to 6 with 1 even. Greb looked to be in better shape than he was in their first encounter, but Flowers still took the early lead, opening cuts over both of his eyes. The two battled furiously over 15 rounds, and at the final bell, Tiger did a handspring before going to his corner, knowing that he had sealed the win. Less than 4 months later, Flowers defended his title against Mickey Walker in Chicago. Walker's manager, Doc Kearns, set the terms for the fight, specifically wanting the venue of Chicago because the commission there only allowed 10-round fights. Kearns believed that Flowers had too much stamina for Walker and that the shorter distance favored his fast-starting fighter. Kearns' hypothesis almost came true. Walker floored Flowers in the first and then the 9th. Flowers appeared unhurt on both occasions, jumping to his feet before the timekeeper started the count. After a furious first round, Flowers then kept Walker out of range, cutting open his eye, leaving Walker blinded by his own blood. The fight was close, and most spectators thought Flowers took 5 rounds. Walker took 4 with 1 even. Others believed Flowers' margin of victory was greater. At the final bell, the referee and only judge, Benny Yanger, raised Walker's hand in victory. The announcement was met by boos and disapproval. Flowers crossed the ring and shook Walker's hand, offering congratulations. The crowd's boos then turned to cheers. Flowers walked back to his dressing room and then broke into tears. He didn't want the crowd to know his disappointment, as he didn't want to be the spark that touched off the fireworks of a riot. Manager Walk Miller had worried about not getting a fair shake should the fight go the distance. He had demanded $65,000 from Jack Kearns up front, and a stipulation in the contract that gave Flowers a return match in 90 days. Flowers never received a rematch. The 90 days had elapsed, and several locations offered to stage the return bout, but no word came forth from Kearns or Walker. Miller mailed copies of the contract to every sports writer, boxing commission, and promoter in the business, pleading his case. But the tactic proved to be moot, as Miller had to cancel several of Flowers' bouts. Tiger began experiencing dizzy spells, complaining of headaches, a cauliflowered right ear, and a bulbous growth over his left eye, which grew more painful by the day. Miller set his fighter up to be operated on by Dr. Wilfred Freilich in what was presumed to be a routine surgery to reshape his ear and remove the growth over his eye. Flowers worried about the surgery since his nemesis Harry Greb had died from a similar operation the year before. Miller accompanied Flowers into the operating room. His fighter wore the tiger bathrobe bearing the huge yellow head of a jungle cat across his shoulders. Flowers gripped his little black Bible as he laid down on the surgeon's table, whispering, "If I die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take." Miller left for his office and informed the staff that he was to be notified as soon as Flowers came out of the anesthetic. Hours went by, and he called the hospital where a nurse advised him, "Come at once." Flowers didn't regain consciousness after the anesthesia was administered. His heart collapsed, and the surgeon pronounced that his death was due to status lymphaticus. Dr. Freilich said that the sudden death to Flowers occurred in only 1 case in 100,000. Miller wanted to press murder charges, stating that the doctors who had performed the autopsy claimed that Flowers had been operated on after he was dead. Flowers was 32 years old. He left behind a wife and a 6-year-old daughter in Atlanta. Gene Tunney was one of the first boxing dignitaries to praise Flowers, stating, quote, "He was a credit to his calling, his race, and his country." Harold Walsh wrote, "The greatest barnstorming fighter that ever lived will travel no more." Flowers' manager, Walk Miller, was devastated by his fighter's death. The two had starved and then prospered together, developing a strong bond of friendship that went beyond their business partnership. Inconsolable, Miller showed up 8 months later at a Gene Tunney fight, looking like an emotional wreck. A month after this public appearance, Miller was found dead by Jess McMahon, the boxing and wrestling promoter. There are 2 reports of how McMahon discovered Miller's body. One describes the deceased as laid out behind a shed, and the other describes Miller on the bedroom floor of his farmhouse. The reports all agree that Miller had a bullet through his brain and another through his heart. A revolver lay in the crook of his elbow. The coroner called the death a suicide. Authorities believe that Miller was in financial distress. He had a farm in Florida that was lost in a hurricane the week before and was closing his boxing camp because he had lost over $20,000 over the previous year. But there was another rumor that he was going to back Jess McMahon in building a new arena in New York City. Writers who knew Miller scoffed at the idea that he was in financial difficulty, noting that he was a shrewd businessman who always acted judiciously. Miller's brother Bert refused to believe that Walk committed suicide. "I can't believe he shot himself," Bert said, "because he had no reason for doing so." An autopsy later revealed that Miller suffered a fracture of the skull in addition to the 2 gunshot wounds. After a few months of investigation, the case was passed over and still referred to as a suicide. Miller's wife Annette was away in Cleveland at the time of his death. An insurance policy was paid out to her even though it had an anti-suicide clause. Boxing writer Jay Thomas played amateur detective 20 years later in a Birmingham News editorial, asking why would Miller be shot on the left side of his temple when he was not a left-handed person? Could he have shot himself in the heart and then in the head, or vice versa? The case remains one of boxing's mysteries.